Okay. Okay, Maria Santos, I think you're on the thing. I've also made you a co-host, so you can start, just watch the admitting and admit people. So we're going to kick things off. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here today for WWIM's 2022 first Lunch and Learn, and acknowledge that we are from the Treaty 6 territory, land of traditional lands of the Cree, the Soto, Stoney, Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota, and of course, homeland of the Métis. My name is Marianne Deutscher, and I'm the executive director for WWIM, and joining as moderator, I think I am moderator. Maria Santos is also on. Maria, if you could show yourself, that would be great. Maria is the new incoming chair for the events committee for WWIM. So we ask everybody to keep their settings on mute, please, and feel free to put questions into the chat, or at the end of the presentation, the chat will have opportunity for questions. It's my pleasure to introduce Brett Elmgren. Today, despite significant efforts and organizational commitment, most organizations struggle to realize their inclusive aspirations. Today, with Brett, we'll explore the belief that you can't change a dominant culture without involving the dominant culture itself. Based on his work in talent management and ED&I strategies with Nutrien and a partnered facilitator with the MARC movement, Brett has significant experience and opportunities to really talk about things from an operational perspective. He is an executive human resources professional, president of AXOM leadership, and a facilitator with the MARC movement through Catalyst. He has his master's degree in leadership from Royal Roads and undergrad from the U of S, proud to call Saskatchewan home and active within the community. So with that, Brett, I'm going to turn it over to you. And oh, Maria's there. So give a wave, Maria, that would be great. She's the new incoming chair. So Brett, and everything will wrap up, I would think, by about 10 to 1, just in case people for timelines for other meetings they might have to commit to.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Marianne. Appreciate that. I'm shamelessly bad at following a schedule, so that'll keep me honest on the back end of this. And great to see you as well, Maria. I wasn't sure that you were here moderating, so this is good. As soon as, which shouldn't take long, I don't know what I'm talking about, I'll just turn it over to you, because I've learned a tremendous amount around this topic from our interactions and previous time working together. So thank you all for being here. It's always so lovely having so many familiar names to make things like this comfortable to as well engage in a very important topic. And I think we'll get started. So if my audio and video is working, we'll just move forward, and please interrupt at any point if the tech drops. But I appreciate the land acknowledgement, Marianne. And just to add and complement to that message, I have a good friend of mine who many of you on the call know by the name of Lisa Mooney. And Lisa Mooney has always encouraged me, when beginning with land acknowledgements, to make them personal, very similar to how we do with safety moments and safety shares, and really reflect on a key question, which is, what does treaty mean to me, and what has treaty afforded me? And this actually was a photo taken a number of weeks back before the cold snap, where it was like -40 for like the last 3 weeks. But on a warmer winter day, after kind of the big first snowfall, girls were outside playing, and they had a friend over, and then the neighbor's dog managed to run into the backyard, and there was just a whole scene going on. And I remember standing in my living room kind of looking back there as the spontaneous snowball fight broke out, and it just made me smile, and I was able to capture kind of that moment of happiness. And then I got thinking about land acknowledgements and what treaty means to me. And to me, it's moments like this, because of our shared history, I'm afforded the opportunity to have memories and experiences out in nature with my family. And so whenever we take a moment to honor the past and our shared history and treaty, these are the things I think about. And I would just leave that with you to consider for land acknowledgements when you deliver them moving forward. Is yes, I'm sitting here on Treaty 6 territory in the traditional homeland of the Métis, and treaty has afforded me moments like this and my family to be out in nature and make great memories. So I thought I'd start with that. And now I'm really curious how you're doing. I came across this cartoon recently and it made me laugh. And it also made me a bit embarrassed because I think I pretty much skipped straight to step 2, and I've kind of stayed there for a long period of time over the last 2 years with the evolution of COVID. But hey, it's the turn of a new year, and it's come with a lot of tension and a lot of complexity. And there's no wrong answer to this question, but I'm hoping we can make today's presentation as interactive as possible. And so I'm going to use some polling technology called Mentimeter. And I thought I would just start with a very basic question to get us familiar with the technology, which is this one. What is one word to describe how you're feeling at the start of 2022? And there's no wrong answer to that. But if you go at the top of the slide, you'll see the instructions. You can get out your smartphone, or if you're on a computer, you can go to the website menti.com. That's menti.com. And you should then have the ability to enter something that looks like this, which is a code. And if you enter in 50, and I'm going to do this with you here, 5079596, that should take you to the word cloud. And you can enter your word directly in there. And I see one person at least was able to interact with the technology who's feeling hopeful today. So that's great. If you could go ahead and just pop something in there. I'm really curious how you're coming into the new year and just how you're feeling today. So I'll give that a minute to populate while I enter my own word. All right. Look at that, interactive in real time. So we've got a few different things out there. So we've got a bit of a mix, right? We've got some hopefulness, but then some energy as well, optimism, excited. And then we've also got tired, which I totally agree with. I'm exhausted, nervous, anxious, all the things, and maybe overwhelmed, right? So it's a good list. And I just want you to know, wherever you're coming into this presentation today, that's the way you're feeling. And that's really important to acknowledge. And it looks like the technology works as well. So thanks with that. I am happy to also report I am wearing pants today. I'm not going to show you them because that would just be weird and creepy. But yes, I'm out of stage 2 on the evolution of COVID here today. All right, so why men? Why talk about engaging men as part of an ED&I strategy? It's a bit of an interesting topic, and it's definitely a different perspective than we typically hear around this. And Marianne, you shared the quote in the opening, and this to me is why. I kind of look at this and say, you can't change the dominant culture without some level of involvement with the dominant culture. And I was tempted to go and dig up a bunch of stats around mining and the nuclear industry specific to the gender imbalance that continues to exist. And to be blunt, I just kind of got lazy. And then I was thinking, well, you know what? Yeah, we could get the specifics, but everybody on the call likely knows what those numbers look like. And all you have to do is look around within your organization just to know how much of a lack of diversity and equity still exists, especially as it relates to gender within our organizations. And hopefully it's getting better and there's positive movement. But if we think about how we make a meaningful step change toward a culture of inclusion, I imagine like a sailboat on the water going into just a massive amount of headwind. If we don't have a strategy focused on the dominant population within the organization, and it's just a passive group or at worst resistant, we're really going to struggle to make meaningful progress. Whereas if we can fully engage that high level of the population, now it becomes a tailwind, and it's amazing to see how fast and how far we could go. So I hope this talk really leaves you feeling motivated and ready to have a dedicated strategy and some approaches for engaging men in your organization to truly activate their advocacy and be champions for inclusion within the companies that you sit within. And so ultimately, that's the objective of the talk. But I'd love to hear from you. So we're going to go back to Mentimeter here just briefly. And I want to ask you this question. Does your organization have a strategy or a specific strategy focused on engaging men in ED&I? And I've given you 3 options here: yes, no, or kind of, sort of, maybe. So maybe you don't know, or maybe you do have one, but it's not that specific. I'm curious. So go ahead, and you see the fun little dots popping up with the percentages. We'll get information from you. So I'll just let that populate, but go ahead and key that in, please. All right, so with 18 respondents coming in on the big board, sound like a game show host here. We've got 1 yes and a dead even split between no and kind of, sort of, maybe. All right, so what that tells us is I think there's substantial opportunity that exists particular to this topic. So how do we do that? Well, if any of you have been in a presentation with me before, and I think many of you have, you're going to roll your eyes when I flip to the next slide. Oh, look at that. No, just pulled ahead. That's exciting. All right, we're going to move to the cultural maturity model. And so you've likely seen this from me before. If you're new to me in the content, I just want to explain the origin of this. So just really briefly, this is an adoption from a safety cultural maturity model from a company called DuPont. And the origins of it is the Bradley curve is what it was called. And it was highly technical. It actually had 5 stages, not 4. And I simplified it down with the help of a partner internally back in my time at Potash Corp, and made it to 4 stages and simplified the language. And I think there's such a story to be told within this that you could pretty much apply these 4 stages around maturity to any cultural transformation or change effort that you're trying to go through within your organization. You could certainly apply this to COVID right now if you think about the general population. But let's look at it from the perspective of inclusion within your organization. And ultimately, people fit into kind of 4 camps or 4 stages on the evolution of maturity. And I'd like you to start thinking about maybe where your organization en masse is at and where the men in your organization, if you had to assume, might be at. But I want to explain the 4 stages. And then I want to talk about some of the mistakes that are quite common that I believe organizations make when it comes to setting strategies around ED&I and how we might do things differently. So first off, stage 1, I call that inclusion is stupid, right? And I know it's blunt language, but stage 1 is all about resistance, right? It is, I wish this didn't exist. These efforts get in the way of production. They get in the way of me and my career and my job. I don't like them. This is done to me, and I'm actively going to work against it. That is a stage 1 mindset. Stage 2 is all about compliance. So it's a step up. And what we get there is kind of passive acceptance. And so these are individuals that will follow along with the company policies and procedures. They'll do what they're told, but they're not doing it because they necessarily want to. And they're certainly not doing it because it's a personal value. They're doing it because inclusion is a requirement or it's an expectation of the organization. So I need to comply. And they view those efforts as done for me. It's the organization's responsibility to provide the direction, and then I will follow along. Stage 3 is a really pivotal transition. And at the heart of that is we shift from this is the organization doing this for me to with me. And this is where it becomes a personal value. And so somebody in a stage 3 mindset doesn't need the organization to tell them to be inclusive. They actually have a personal value of inclusion themselves. And so the advocacy comes along for the ride, and ultimately they get engaged and they feel this is our collective responsibility. So then what's the difference between 3 and 4? Well, 4 is kind of the mountaintop. And ultimately, this is now where it becomes your culture, because you have such a collective mass of people within the organization that have a value of inclusion that it simply becomes the way you do things around here. And you almost don't need policies and procedures and all of that, formality, because it takes care of itself, because everything outside of inclusive actions and behaviors would be so out of step with the organization's culture that it just wouldn't be allowed to exist. So I'm curious, where do you think your organization is today? And I'm not going to quite ask you to plot that in the poll just yet, but I do want you to think about what might some of the mistakes we make around inclusive strategies be in alignment with this model. And the ones that I've seen, I want to take you through. I'll say the big one that we tend to make an error on is, and you could apply this again to safety strategy, which is a great parallel, or any other strategy in the organization, is generally speaking, and it would make sense that the people setting the strategy, where do you think they are in this model? The people setting the strategy are in a stage 4. That's why they have their jobs. They obviously have a value around it, or at least I hope they do. They're passionate about it. They're educated. And so they're setting the organization's direction around these things. But where's the rest of the organization? Well, it depends, right? But if this is a new initiative, it's probably further on the left side of that than on the right side. And if you have people that are in a stage 1 or a 2, and you're setting a stage 4 strategy, the gap is so big that it actually leads to more resistance, which isn't a massive problem if it's a small percentage of the organization that's at stage 1 or stage 2. But when it's the dominant culture within the organization and the strategy is trying to push and the gap is too big, the resistance kicks in stronger. And because it's dominant, it actually pulls the organization back even further. So what do we do differently? And I hope that makes sense. I know this is technical to kind of start out the talk here, but we need to be setting strategies that are one step ahead of where people are at and moving them along. And that requires more complexity in the strategic approach, meaning that you likely need to have different strategies for the different stages that all coexist within the organization. So what might those look like? So if somebody's in a stage 1, what's the strategy? Well, it's blunt, but they got to get out of the organization. You cannot tolerate people in a stage 1. They're constantly recruiting, they're toxic, they're demonstrating behaviors completely out of alignment with the expectations of the organization. So compliance is necessary as a strategy, as a minimum foundation. I know a lot of people are uncomfortable with compliance as a strategy because it definitely has consequences around a command and control structure, but compliance gets you out of resistance, because if you mandate compliance, then those individuals have to exit the organization or at minimum comply to the expectations, right? So that's a strategy to move from 1 to 2, is actually to enforce compliance. But usually speaking, stage 1 isn't the dominant number. Stage 2 is often the dominant number when we start out. And so how do you go from compliance to independence? And the mistake we often make here, and this is a tough thing to explain, but you can't force a value upon anybody. And we try to do this all the time as organizations, right? We set an organizational value around inclusion, and that's good, right? Because it tells you what the organization is committed to and what the organization values. But then we just roll out a bunch of training programs and say, hey, everybody, you now have a value of inclusion. But only an individual can come to their own values. So the hard work here and the messy work is to try to create an environment that allows people to inspire a value themselves. And I'm sure the big question is, well, how the heck do you do that, right? And that's hard. And there's no clear answer for me on that one. But I would say, think about where you have done this successfully in your organizations. And likely the answer to that is safety. If you think about where you were 10 years ago with your safety culture in your organization, and the mining industry has made incredible advancements in this space, what has worked to get to a collective mass of people within your organization to really realize a personal value, not an organizational value, but a personal value around safety? It's often making it personal. It's talking about experiences, right? If we have an unfortunate lived experience around the impact of safety, talking about those things and working through those things are really powerful. But ultimately, it's at the emotional level where we kind of have to work there. And it does take time and it takes ongoing commitment, but slowly over time, we can create the conditions where people identify the value in themselves. And that pulls us into stage 3. And then when we're in stage 3, how do we go from 3 to 4? Well, that's about ultimately activation and sustainment. This is a great place to be, because now you've got a collective group of people that have a value around the topic. And now it's a matter of realizing the value of that. And so this is where it's important to get barriers out of the way, to provide the blueprint. And what I'm envisioning here is according to our topic today, if there's a group of men in your organization that have a value around inclusion, we should be doing everything we can to help support the activation of that within the organization. So here's what you can do to sponsor people. Here's what you can do to advocate. Here's what you can do to champion. Here's all of the things that you can do. How do we remove barriers for you? And how do we help you to sustain and activate that value? And then ultimately that pushes us into a stage 4. Whew, that's a long ramble, kind of done. All right, so I'm curious, where do you think the men are within your organization? I hope that made sense. And again, at any time, feel free to pop questions in the chat. I would love to have some time at the end for questions. And if a couple really whoppers come in there, I'll be sure to check them. But let's just ask you that question in the Menti poll. So now that you have a bit of an overview of the 4 stages, and this is unfair because it's an assumption and it's a judgment, but what stage do you believe on average, and again, it's on average, most men are at in your organization? And we know that this is highly variable, right? I'm betting you know some stage 4s and some stage 1s and everything in between. But on average, if you think about the collective group of men within your organization, where would you plot them? All right. It's a runaway. All right. So we're feeling pretty strongly that the majority are in a stage of compliance, right? And that's not a surprise to me, right? I mean, generally speaking, I would hope our organizations have good processes in place to rid the organization of resistance. But it's really challenging to cross that chasm, I always say, from stage 2 to stage 3, because we can't do it for people, right? We need them to come along for the ride by inspiring a value. So the rest of this, I want to focus on how we might consider doing that. An approach to engaging men to shift out of compliance to a stage of commitment. And in order to do that, I think it's really important to ask the next question here, if my slides will move. 1 second. There we go. Yeah, I think they're moving. Let me know if they're still frozen. Barriers. All right. So I'm curious what you think around this, but then I'm actually going to share what the data tells us. What are the top reasons why men don't engage in gender initiatives at work? So I'm specifically going to focus this on the gender conversation. So I'm narrowing it a bit from broad-based inclusion, but the data is pretty relevant here. And so where I've gathered this from is, I think Marianne mentioned at the start, I'm a certified partner with Catalyst, which is a great organization and has a movement called Men Advocating Real Change that also has workshops and programming that I was lucky enough to help coordinate internally when I was with Potash Corp and Nutrien. And now I have the opportunity to facilitate that programming. And they've got tremendous research and great free resources online at mark.org. So I'd highly encourage you to share that and ask the men in your organization to engage with that community. There's a tremendous amount of content. But ultimately, they have surveyed men over the globe in a confidential and anonymous manner and asked them this question. And I also have my own personal experience because I've had the benefit of facilitating closed door conversations with men in operational settings. And we discussed this as well. And so I looked at this question and I thought about what my own experiences were and whether or not they matched the data. And I would absolutely agree with what the data said. So here's the top 3, the big reveal. I know you're on pins and needles on the edge of your seat. All right, the big 3 reasons why men don't engage in gender initiatives are apathy, fear, and ignorance. All right, I'm going to explain each one of these briefly. So apathy, the quote I put in there is, it doesn't directly impact me. Now, this will not often be publicly stated unless it's in a closed door conversation, or it still might not be publicly stated. But the uncomfortable truth is the oppression or inequalities that currently exist in the organization often just aren't experienced by men because they are the dominant culture. And as a result of that, there is just a natural sense of apathy that comes along. And this is where I actually think inclusion is different than safety, right? There's a lot of parallels to be drawn from safety, but safety will kill anybody, right? If something goes wrong, there is no gender imbalance aside from just the population, right? That it could get exposed to the particular issue. But when it comes to inclusion, as we know, there are certain demographics within our organizations that are hit with these things every single day. And there are some demographics like my own that very seldom, if ever, experience the inequalities that permeate. So as a result of that, the natural impact tends to be a sense of apathy. The second one is fear. And I think we need to look at this one without judgment. It's important here. So loss of status. And I'm going to talk about that in the next 2 slides a bit. But ultimately, the reality too is, for the most part, our organizations were created by men. They continue to be led by men. And the uncomfortable truth is they really benefit men. And so there is a lot of data to suggest that men benefit a lot as well when we improve diversity and inclusion within our organizations. But it doesn't feel that way when ultimately it seems like something is being taken away from you. And so the honest truth that most men will express, in confidential settings is there's a fear of a loss of status that comes along if ultimately we do change the existing system. The next thing too is making mistakes, right? This is where the cancel culture term comes in, or whatever you want to use to kind of help understand it. But let's say I do have a stage 3 mindset and I've got a value around inclusion. And so, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to advocate. And then I say the wrong thing or I do the wrong thing. And then, I get reprimanded or shamed as a result of that. Well, it's a lot safer to just not say anything than to actually engage. And so that is also working against men as it relates to full engagement. And then the other real impact is ostracization from other men within the organization. Think of an environment where all the boys are going out for beers at the strip club after the conference, right? And you're the one to stand up and say, you know what, guys, this isn't okay, right? Think of the impact that comes along with taking a courageous stance like that, right? Ostracization is a very real thing that's an impact, and it causes men to pull back as it relates to their advocacy on this topic. And then the last one is ignorance. And I don't mean that in just like, oh, I'm dumb and I don't understand this kind of ignorance, but there's this ignorance, which is very much related to the first point. Is there actually a problem? And I know that's probably really hard to hear, I could imagine, for an underrepresented group that is impacted by this every single day. But if your lived experience isn't that these things exist for you, there's just a natural ignorance that comes along with that. So that's just to set some framing around why there's maybe a lack of advocacy, or when you looked at the maturity model and you're thinking, yeah, stage 2 or maybe stage 1, these tend to be the reasons why we get stuck in those stages. So how do we overcome these things? That's where I want to go next. So I love this learning model. Again, a shout out to Lisa Mooney, who introduced me to it. It's work that comes out of the Truth and Reconciliation of Canada. And I think I could not imagine a better cultural maturity strategy than this, which is head, heart, hands. And what it really stands for is, if we are going to try to make culture change with a group of people that are pretty darn happy with the status quo, we first need to start with intellectual buy-in. Then we need to get to emotional buy-in, and then ultimately we go to behavioral buy-in. We usually do this in reverse. You know, we say, hey, we want a bunch of people to perform differently in the company. So here's your actions and behaviors and your playbook of how you can do things differently, which is fine, except for the fact that they don't care and they don't even see the problem as needing to be solved. So we need to start with intellectual first, then move to emotional, and then to behavioral. So I'm going to guide you through some ways that I've tried to approach this within the organizations that I've been lucky enough to work with, the good, the bad, and the ugly around this. So we'll take a quick little journey through head, heart, hands. So let's start with number 1. If my slide will advance again here. Oh, hang on. There we go. There's the goldfish. So there's this old, what do you call it, a proverb of a fish swimming in water. And it's just hanging out. It's doing its thing. Say it's Nemo, you know. He's chilling, he's swimming, away we go. And then comes along another fish and just says, hey, how's the water today? And the fish looks at him and says, water? What water? And I think that proverb relates pretty closely to kind of this whole ignorance and apathy piece, right? Is to men in the organization, we need to start with actually understanding that there is a problem here that needs to be solved, because the current organization is maybe totally okay in terms of how they see things. And so I like this quote: before individuals can support a change initiative, they must first be convinced that there is something wrong with the status quo, right? And so how do we do that? And then this is the real uncomfortable truth. And I love this quote: when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. There's a key word in that we need to highlight, which is feels. Because our tendency when we're interacting with somebody that we think just doesn't get it is to provide information. And I know this is coming in conflict with, like you said, intellectual buy-in. So naturally my head goes to, here's a bunch of stats and data and information, or, oh, you got to read this article, or you got to watch this podcast, or you got to listen to this book. And if you do that, you'll just see the light and come along for the ride. But the problem with that is you're speaking to the emotional and rational part of the brain. Whereas the resistance comes from the emotional part of the brain. It's a feeling, right? When you're accustomed to privilege, equality doesn't rationalize as oppression, it feels like oppression. So in order to help convince that there is a problem that needs to solve, we need to connect with people at a feeling level, at an emotional level. And so how do we do that? Well, I don't know. I haven't been gifted at doing this, that's for sure. I've struggled. But the best way that I know how is to try to come up with stories that relate to the dominant culture to help them intellectually understand the issue while still maybe connecting emotionally to the problem. The story I like sharing around this comes from this movie. So this is some of you probably heard me say this before. This is from Moneyball. So if we could, I wish we show hands how many people have seen the movie Moneyball. But generally speaking, a lot of people have seen this movie and a lot of men watch baseball. Right? Now, I know those are generalizations, doesn't always work for everybody. But what's Moneyball about? Well, it's a story about baseball, but really it's a story about the economics of baseball. And anybody who follows baseball a little bit knows that baseball is unique in the sense that it's the only major sport that doesn't have a salary cap. So what's a salary cap? What that means is in other sports, there's a limit for each team on how much money they can spend on players. In baseball, there is no limit. So it totally depends on how rich the owner is of these sports teams in terms of how much money they have accessible to go and buy talent. As an example, 2 years ago, I think it was, my hated Los Angeles Dodgers, I just cannot stand that team, San Francisco Giants fan for any baseball fans out there. So that'll help explain that one. They had a payroll of $240 million. And they played in the World Series against the Tampa Bay Rays, a team that had $71 million, right? So just do the math there. It's, you know, a little shy of 4 times the amount of financial resources to buy the best players, to go and pick the best free agents. But at the end of the day, the World Series isn't determined by your finances. It's just however many runs you score, whichever team scores, and they're all playing the exact same game. Which is why if you're a fan of a poor sports team, it feels incredibly unfair in baseball because you are cash constrained, you can never sign the good players, and that's the exact story of what happens in the movie Moneyball. And that's exactly like the systems within our organization. We're mining, right? We're manufacturing, we're operating, we're performing all of the same work. We are playing the same game, but the resources by which we do so and the barriers that exist are completely unequal based off of the demographics that exist within our company. So it's stories like that that I try to use to articulate the problem, which connects maybe to an emotional experience of being mad about the economics of baseball, and ultimately logical as it relates to how those inequities exist within our organizations. But the best we can do is try to start with gaining an intellectual understanding that there is a problem that needs to be solved. Now we go to the hard part. And I do want to acknowledge right off the bat, I'm going to share some information here that can be triggering for people, because in a moment, I'm going to share a story. And then I'm also going to pull up some examples of just the different experiences that women face, maybe daily within organizations that, to be honest, until explicitly spoken about, a lot of men just don't quite realize even exist. And if you've ever experienced some of these things, this can be highly triggering. All right. So do what you need to do, I suppose, as it relates to keeping yourself safe through this. But I do want to explain that I'm going to get into a couple personal stories about some experiences that continue to exist in our organizations that women face, and they're pretty ugly scenarios. But the first one is really, it's a personal story. I want to start by sharing that I have permission as well to share this story because it's not mine, but I was granted permission to speak on behalf of it. And I'm going to keep the details pretty general. But ultimately, how do we create emotional buy-in? Any of you who've made progress in safety culture probably knows the value of a good safety share, or even more so, the real value of a near miss, or at worse, if you've experienced a serious injury or fatality within your organization, or have been close to somebody that's been impacted by that, or you have personally, you'll never forget it because our experiences are ultimately what shapes our beliefs, right? And so the more we can do to tell stories that have real emotional impact can start to create emotional buy-in. And this was the moment, and so it's the story I share, and it's the moment that I would say I really crossed over into what I hope was advocating on behalf of inclusion. And here's how it goes. So it was a long time ago, a number of years ago, a couple of organizations ago, and we had a job opportunity coming up. And there was an employee that I had worked with at a previous company that I thought this job was going to be perfect for. And so I reached out and asked her if she'd meet me at Starbucks, which is why we have the Starbucks photo here. And so we sat down for a cup of coffee, and I was excited to say, hey, we've got this great opportunity. I knew the individual, knew a little bit about her career aspirations. I also kind of knew that she's maybe a little bit stuck in her current company, and thought, hey, this is a perfect opportunity. What do you think? And I was surprised that there was more hesitation than I expected. I could tell there was some interest, but I could also tell there was a lot of hesitation. And I didn't push it, and I didn't really know why. And so I just kind of left it and said, you know, this is getting posted in a couple of weeks, so think about it, and maybe we can reconnect. Well, a couple of weeks go by, posting goes up, and she doesn't apply. And so I reached back out before the posting is closing, and I just said, hey, can we meet back for coffee? So back we go to Starbucks. It's a good opportunity to get lots of caffeine. So we sit back down, we talk about it. And what does she tell me? Well, at that point, she says, you know, you probably sensed some hesitation last time we connected. And the reason why is I'm definitely interested in the job. But what I didn't tell you at the time that I'm comfortable telling you now is I'm actually pregnant, and we're expecting our second child. And it's really early. And I just don't think it would be fair to the organization if I took an opportunity knowing that I was going to step away on leave. And it was that moment where you just realize, oh, wow, this is so hard, right? Because here's somebody that's already, in her mind, putting the company's best interest at heart before even joining the organization. So we talked about it and basically kind of left it and said, I really hope that's not the reason. I encourage you to apply, all those good things. But ultimately, if it's just not the right timing because the stress and family pressures or whatever it happens to be, I understand. So she doesn't apply for the role. What's interesting about this scenario is who got the role. Internally within the organization, there was a male employee, an internal candidate, a little bit less qualified, but still pretty skilled, a good candidate, but on paper, not quite as good as the external. And this individual has his wife who's pregnant with their second child, a couple months ahead, but essentially the exact same stage of life. And he was almost upset that we just didn't give him the job. At no point was there any conversation or consideration to the fact that, hey, having a child might impact the organization or myself. It was foot on the gas and almost a sense of, why haven't I been given this opportunity? So you see a very stark contrast, right, between the inequities exist. You carry the story forward a little bit further and it gets a little bit more tragic, right? So a few months later, I meet with the external and just connect and we have a conversation. And it's that point at that same coffee shop when we're talking, and she shares kind of the heartbreaking news, not kind of the heartbreaking news, that they experienced a miscarriage, right? And so now you're going through the tragedy within your family of experiencing something like that and overcoming that experience. And also knowing that you passed up a potentially great career opportunity as a result by putting the company first. Men in the organization never have to experience that in that same way, right? And it's those kinds of stories and those kinds of examples that help shine a light on just how challenging and the lack of equity that truly do exist within our organizations. There's a really powerful exercise that we facilitate in the Mark workshop where you have a series of cards, and there's a lot of them. I think, we have maybe up to 50 of them. And on each card are examples like that, but in a sentence. And they range in severity from maybe a microaggression to something really, really major. And what we do is we hand them out one by one and we ask the men to read them. And it's like death by 1,000 cuts. And I just want to share a few of the examples of what are on those cards. This is all from a gender perspective. This doesn't even incorporate intersectionality or a whole bunch of other components to diversity. When I get promoted, people don't assume it was to fill a quota. I can limit attention and expense on my appearance without fear of extreme judgment. When traveling alone, I don't worry about being targeted for violence because of my gender. When I have kids, people don't assume my work will suffer. I can naturally age without being judged as quote unquote letting myself go. When considering a new position, I don't have to be concerned about when it's too soon to become pregnant. I can choose not to have children without others questioning my masculinity. I can work in the office alone at night without feeling concerned about my safety. I can get upset about a decision without people blaming my hormones. I don't have to feel like I need to choose between a career path or a family path. When I leave a meeting, I'm not expected to clean the room. I am not paid less because of my gender. And I can set down my drink at a work function without having to be concerned about being drugged or assaulted. We read these things, 40, 50 of them, and it's like death by 1,000 cuts. And then we get into a conversation around this concept of otherness. And we start talking about times where maybe we as men have experienced otherness. Because no matter how privileged the individual, and boy, am I in that state of privilege, there are still times in our lives where we felt like the outsider. And by sharing those stories, it starts to bring that emotional connection to the feeling that happened within us during those times. And collectively, by hearing those things that exist every single day currently within our organization, coupled with our own personal experiences at times where we felt that way, that's the best we know how to hopefully inspire an emotional connection to the fact that, hey, it's not okay to just stay on the sidelines on this one anymore. It's time to activate some advocacy. And that's what emotional buy-in is all about. Then we move to the final stage, which ultimately is behavioral buy-in. And I want to share a really quick story because I know I'm running out of time here. There's this model that I just love, beliefs, behaviors, outcomes. I'm a firm believer in this, right? Is that ultimately Our beliefs are what shape the behaviors that we demonstrate, and our behaviors lead to outcomes. And those outcomes reinforce our beliefs. And it's just kind of this reinforcing circle. I'll explain that in a story, though. We had a CEO change a while back, not a recent one, at Nutrien/Potash Corp. And it was in a particular business unit within the organization. And we were onboarding the individual, and we were having a meeting about the current state of equity, diversity, and inclusion within the business unit. New leader coming in, overwhelmed, lots of information. We had an hour, I think, set for this. It was at the end of a Friday, I won't forget, because we went for a beer afterward. But we're sitting down in the meeting. And what do? Well, kind of make a mistake. We pop up a whole bunch of stats and say, okay, here are the current demographics within your business unit. Here's the current state of inclusion. Here's the data that you might need to know about what's going on. And so that's why I chose kind of that analytical photo that you see on the screen here. And he just stops us mid-sentence and looks around and said, can you shut off the laptop? Okay, so we shut off the laptop. And he looks everybody in the eye and said, you know what I want to do instead? Let's all go around and talk about why we believe in this work. And it just flattened us and said, I'd love to hear why all of you care and why all of you believe in inclusion. Gets back to that whole personal value piece, right? And for the next, what ended up being 2 hours, everybody went around and told personal stories and historical experiences to why they believed in this, right? And so I think it's really important that we always come back to our beliefs, because our advocacy will only go so far unless we have that fundamental belief. This is a model I use in kind of lots of my other training that I do, which I talk about the leadership test. And that comes from a good friend and fellow of mine named Drew Dudley, who wrote a fantastic book called Day One Leadership. But ultimately, we have our own personal values, right? And then we have our behavior. And on a good day, and hopefully most days, our values are perfectly aligned with our behavior, right? You can see our values reflected through the choices, actions, and behaviors that we make and demonstrate. But on some days, there is a gap. We say we value safety, but we go home and cut the grass in flip-flops, or we text and drive, or we don't wear our PPE at home, or whatever it happens to be. And so the leadership test really is all about asking you that question: does my behavior reflect my value of inclusion? And I think that's an important question for people who truly do believe they're in a stage 3 or a stage 4, and you've got that value ingrained. Are my actions and behaviors reflecting that value consistently? And that's what behavioral buy-in is all about. There are, of course, great playbooks to be a more inclusive leader. Every company and their dog now has a different model on how to do that. Here's a big laundry list from Catalyst, and it's in the slides. This is being recorded and will be distributed as well. You can also pull this material directly off of Mark's website. So if you go to catalyst.org/Mark, Mark with a C, Men Advocating Real Change, this and tremendous amounts of more information is available to you. So, but rather than, use this time to say, okay, here's 10 steps to be a more inclusive leader, I think it's far more important that people personalize the actions and behaviors that they believe they can advocate for and demonstrate in the organization based off of their belief and their value. And then once they've identified that custom list of things that really make a difference, then encouraging and supporting them as an organization to ask that leadership test question. Does your value of inclusion become reflected consistently day after day through your actions and behaviors? So that's it. I'm going to leave you with that here to kind of bring us to a close. But I did notice a few names that are familiar. There's a couple men on the line here today. And I would encourage you, if you're on the fence, or if you're experiencing that apathy, that fear, that ignorance in some capacity, or maybe you're just a little bit nervous and you need to activate a bit of courage, I'll look to you and I'll say, hey, look, it starts with us, and we cannot change the dominant culture if we ourselves don't engage as the dominant culture. And I just love this quote by Dr. Martin Luther King, which is, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but we will remember the silence of our friends. And let's not stay on the sidelines anymore. Let's get engaged. Let's activate our value of inclusion and collectively partner on gender partnership to make our organizations much healthier, safer, and better for everybody. So with that, that brings it all to a close. And thank you, Maria. I see you've posted the Catalyst website link in the chat. If you want to reach out with me, there's my smiling face. I must only have one suit. I think I'm wearing the exact same outfit today. So I promise that wasn't taken today. But axomleadership.com, and there's my social channels, all that good stuff. I do post weekly videos on those channels as well on all things leadership and culture. So feel free to engage in the conversation there. And with that, look at that. I actually finished on time. So we have time for questions. If you're willing to stick around and ask a few, I'd encourage you to pop those in the chat, and love to answer any questions you might have. So that's what I got, Marianne.
Great. We'll just take a quick few minutes. I'm sure we'll get one or two questions in the chat, and definitely encourage people to follow you. I know I really enjoy the weekly videos, and I just find them refreshing and great topics that are quick and easy to listen to.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Right. No
Okay.
questions unless I'm not seeing anything here.
No,
so
I'm not seeing any. So on behalf of WWIM, Brett, can't say enough. Really touched me when you talked about the need to connect emotionally and doing that through stories, because that creates the learning. And for me, that's a really very interesting insight and takeaway in getting those stories and feeling people to tell them. Again, we appreciate you doing this. We are making a donation to STARS Air Ambulance on your behalf in recognition of you providing your valued expertise. I can't say enough how much we appreciate that. So thank you very much. For those that are on the call, we will be sending out a SurveyMonkey link asking for your feedback. So please, takes 2 minutes. The events committee really appreciates that. And we will have our sessions are scheduled for February, March, April, and into May. And those will be posted regularly and encourage people to register. And with that, I'll just make sure there's no other questions. No. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And the recording will be available later. Have yourself a great February, because I honestly feel like January is just going to come by in a blink. So again, thank you very much. Truly appreciate it, and have everyone a great day.
Take care, everybody. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.